Stephanie was born in Washington, D.C., and as the daughter of a Foreign Service officer, lived in New Zealand and in France, as well as Arlington, Virginia. She graduated from Brown University and has a master's degree from Harvard. Mrs. Deutsch was initially attracted to the subject for family reasons. Her husband, David, which is here, taking pictures, is the great-grandson of Julius Rosenwald. When studying Rosenwald led her to the story of his partnership with Booker T. Washington, she began to realize how little was known about the times in which both men lived, and in particular about conditions surrounding the creation of the Rosenwald schools. Since then, she has told the story of the collaboration between Washington and Rosenwald in many settings. Stephanie has lived on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. since 1975 and has for 15 years served as chairman of the Grants Committee of the Capitol Hill Community Foundation, which gives away $250,000 a year in grants, in small grants. Stephanie has written articles and book reviews for the New York Times, Washington Times Weekly, the Weekly Standard, and the Millions blog. She and her husband retired. David is a retired television director. They have 4 grown children and 1 grandson. Okay. Well, without further ado, I will give you Stephanie. Thank you.
It's great to be with you all. Like me, you probably read this week obituaries about Pete Seeger. And one of the things that caught my attention was in the New York Times obituary, it ended with a quote from Pete Seeger, and he said, "The key to the future of the world is finding the optimistic stories and letting them be known." Well, one reason I like telling this story of the collaboration of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald and their partnership with African American communities all across the South is that it's an optimistic story. It has strands that come from the terrible legacy of slavery, and it has strands of prejudice and inequality, but it weaves them together with strands of optimism and vision and energy and faith and philanthropy. And so it's really an extremely optimistic story. And I think that's one reason I was so captivated by it. When I started doing research, I had started with the idea of writing something about Rosenwald. And that led me to Booker T. Washington. And I realized, gosh, I really don't know this history very well. And as I started to learn it, I just became fascinated. And it's a wonderful story that is becoming more widely known, and you in Reedville are very lucky, you can change, because you have some reminders of this story right here in your community. This is the Avalon School, which I visited a year and a half ago, and this is probably more familiar to you. This is the Julius Rosenwald High School, very close to here. Let's see, the Avalon School was built in 1925. It's the 3-teacher type, and the files of the Rosenwald Fund indicate that local African Americans raised $2,600 to pay for this school. This school, the Julius Rosenwald High School, and I'm reading from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources marker in front of the school, it says, originally known as Northumberland County Training School. This institution opened in 1917 under the principal John M. Ellison. Local African Americans raised more than $7,000 to build the school and received additional funding from the Rosenwald Fund. On 12 November 1932, under its principal, the Reverend Dr. Henry M. Ruffin, the school was renamed Julius Rosenwald High School. It closed in 1958. One of the most amazing things about the story of Rosenwald schools that I'll get to a little later is the fact that dollar for dollar, African Americans in rural communities, most of them, raised and contributed more money than the Rosenwald Fund did. So this was not a philanthropist giving something. This was a philanthropist and an educator working in partnership with people. The story of the Rosenwald schools has its root in slavery, and you all probably know that under slavery, people were deprived of their freedom, but they were also, in some ways, much more detrimentally, they were deprived of their potential because education was forbidden to them. Events like the Nat Turner slave uprising terrified whites, and one thing they thought was that if slaves could read, could communicate, it would increase the likeliness that they would somehow get together. So in Virginia, as in many other states, it was actually illegal to teach a slave to read. In his wonderful memoir of his life as a slave, Frederick Douglass, who grew up on the eastern shore of Maryland, records the fact that he, in fact, was taught to read. His owner's wife saw that he was a smart boy, and she taught him to read, and he overheard his master telling his wife, if you teach that boy to read, he won't be fit to be a slave. And Frederick Douglass thought, well, that sounds good to me. If that's what it takes, okay, I'm in. So that was the world in which Booker T. Washington grew up. He, of course, was from Virginia, the mountains near Roanoke, and was born there a slave in 1856. In his book about growing up, in Up From Slavery, he records an episode that is so vivid. As a little boy, one of his jobs was to ride with his master's daughter was a teacher. And she would ride a horse to her job at a little country schoolhouse. And so Booker's job as a little boy, an 8-, 9-year-old, was to ride on the back of the horse and then bring the horse back so it could work in the fields during the day. And he wrote in Up From Slavery about how when he dropped Laura Burroughs off at the school, he got off his horse and he peered in the window. And he said the sight of those boys and girls sitting at their desks with their books looked like paradise to him. And it was something that was forbidden to him, and it was something that he wanted. So freedom came when he was 9 years old, emancipation. He moved with his family to West Virginia, and still going to school was not automatic for him. His family was extremely poor, and he had to go to work in a salt mine to help, a coal mine. There were salt mines and coal mines, but I think this was in a coal mine. Another vivid episode that he describes was, it was all dark, and he was down in the mine, and two miners were talking. And one said to the other, there's this school, and if you go there, you don't have to pay, and it's for black people. And Washington wrote that he was so excited hearing this, and he kind of crept a little closer to them to try and hear, well, what was the name of the school? And the one miner told the other, it's called Hampton. And Hampton had been founded by the Freedmen's Bureau to educate African Americans and to educate teachers to go out, because obviously, since education had been forbidden, you had this huge population of people with no education. So Washington did manage to get to Hampton. And this is him at his graduation from Hampton. I love this picture because I find it very striking. He looks, at the same time, very determined and slightly anxious about what the future may hold. He was his graduation speaker. He did very well at Hampton. And he went on to become a teacher. And then in 1880, the principal of Hampton was asked to recommend someone to go down to Alabama to found a school similar to Hampton. And he had been asked to recommend a well-qualified white man. And the principal of Hampton wrote to the folks in Alabama, I'm sending you Booker T. Washington. I know of no white man who could do better. So as a young man, age 25, Washington headed down to Alabama. And those of you who've been to Tuskegee know that it's very rural. It's about 40 miles east of Montgomery. And he went down there. There was really nothing there. And just by sheer hard work and determination, he built up that school so that by the end of the 20th century, by the end of the 19th century, it was one of the biggest schools in the South. Co-ed right from the start, bringing people in and educating them to be teachers. It also taught trades, as Hampton had, and so the buildings on the campus were all built by the students. The bricks were manufactured right there out of the clay, and when you go there, you'll see it's the bricks are a very beautiful, they're sort of this color actually, and it's quite an impressive campus. One thing I like about this picture is you'll see up in the corner the flag. I've read that when Booker T. Washington started flying the flag on the campus of Tuskegee, you hadn't seen the American flag in that part of Alabama since before the Civil War. Feelings were, it took a while to recover from that. The school did well. Booker T. Washington turned out to be a brilliant fundraiser, among other things, and so he spent a lot of time traveling up north to speak to audiences about what was going on down south, raising money, and running the school and keeping it well endowed. In 1895, he was asked to be the speaker at a World's Fair type exhibition in Atlanta called the Atlanta Cotton States Exhibition. He was the only African-American speaker there. Of course, a segregated audience, so that any blacks in the audience would have been up in the Jim Crow balcony. And he gave a speech that was very short, 5 minutes long, but very optimistic and upbeat, and also said something which later became very controversial. He spoke of the way blacks and whites could work together to create greater economic viability for the South, which was still suffering the effects of the Civil War. And he said, in all things that are purely social, we, blacks and whites, can be as separate as the fingers of the hand, but will be one as a fist when it comes to mutual benefit and mutual assistance. That later became controversial, and W.B. Du Bois called that speech the Atlanta Compromise. Some people think that that's its actual official name. That was what it was called. But anyway, this is the background of Booker T. Washington. Tremendous success, tremendous fame. After the speech, he became the most well-known African American. He had dinner at the White House with President Theodore Roosevelt. He was given an honorary degree at Harvard. He even had tea with Queen Victoria at Windsor Palace. So he was extremely successful and well-known. But this is against a background of conditions that are actually not getting better. They're in many ways getting worse. You remember in 1896, you had Plessy versus Ferguson, which made separate but equal the law of the land, and it started with train cars, but then it spread to hotels and schools and public parks and all kinds of facilities. You had the states rewriting their constitutions to make it harder for African Americans to vote, and then you had lynching. You had really a reign of terror in many places, just horrifying violence against blacks. You can change, Betty. Can you see who's in the middle of this picture? I love this picture. One of the things that Washington did was he got a lot of prominent people to come visit Tuskegee. And in 1896, Frederick Douglass was the graduation speaker. You can see his distinctive profile in the middle. And actually, Douglass, I guess it was 1895. Anyway, Douglass died shortly after that. And so when Booker T. Washington made his speech in Atlanta, people started writing him letters and saying, "You're our Douglass now. You're the new Douglass," because he had just died. Okay. This is the Oaks. It's Booker T. Washington's house across the street from the campus of Tuskegee. You'll see that it also was built by students, and if you visit there, you can tour the house. And this is Booker T. Washington's family. One thing I find very touching about Washington is he had a tragic family life. His first wife was a young woman he had known in West Virginia, where he grew up, and she went to Hampton, came down to Tuskegee. They were married. They had a daughter, and when the daughter was 1 year old, she died. The wife died. He remarried a year later a woman who was a teacher at the school, Olivia Davidson, who was a very beautiful, very well-educated woman, and they had 2 little boys, and then she died. So as quite a young man, he was twice widowed with 3 young children and quite a heavy burden of sorrow. He remarried Margaret Murray, who was educated at Fisk and took over his family, but he had suffered a lot personally. Well, in 1911, he met Julius Rosenwald. You can change. Who was Julius Rosenwald? He was the son of immigrants. His parents came from Germany. They came over separately, but from the same part of Germany, and they came for the usual reasons that immigrants come, wanting a better life, more economic opportunity, but they had an additional reason, which is that they were Jewish. And at this time, in the part of Germany where they lived, there was a lot of prejudice against Jews. There were a lot of special taxes they had to pay. They couldn't go to university. They couldn't go into the professions, law, medicine, all that was off limits to them. So life was really very limited for them. They came to the States, and by the time Julius was born in 1862, his father was running a clothing store in Springfield, Illinois. This is the house where Julius grew up, and it is right across the street from Abraham Lincoln's house in Springfield. So if you go to Springfield and visit Lincoln's house, this is now a Park Service office, and it's the house that Julius grew up in. So he grew up in a small town, helping his father in the store, getting a Jewish education. There were only a handful of other Jewish families in town, but he had a bar mitzvah and learned Judaism. As a 16-year-old, interestingly, the same age that Booker was when he left his home to go to Hampton, Julius left home and went to New York to be apprenticed to his uncles and learned the clothing trade, and came back to Chicago and started a business with his brother. And in 1895, the same year as Booker T. Washington's speech, Julius got a business opportunity. He was asked if he wanted to buy into a small, unknown mail-order company called Sears Roebuck. And he later wrote that he thought about it for about 5 minutes and decided, yes, this was a business with a future. And someone said to me the other day, and it's absolutely true, that mail order was kind of what the internet has been in our lifetimes, just an absolute revolution in merchandising at a time when people lived on farms, they didn't have access to stores. Sears was phenomenal. And by the time Julius was 40, he was a millionaire many times over. And, okay, you can change. This is the Sears plant outside Chicago. And it not only had the Sears managerial offices, it had a printing press where they printed the catalog, and some of you, like me, probably remember the Sears catalog from when we were kids, all those pictures. And it also backed onto a railroad siding so that they would package everything up, process the orders, package them up, ship them out, and it was a huge state-of-the-art plant, and quite dramatically successful. You could buy everything at Sears, from baby booties to seeds for your garden to a tombstone. And you could even buy houses. In Arlington, near where we live, there are some Sears houses still standing. So Julius is newly very wealthy, and he did what a lot of us would do if we suddenly found ourselves in that situation. He built a big house. He had a wife and 5 children by this time. And he took a nice trip to Europe. Okay, you can change. Well, this is Julius with his family. He had 2 sons and 3 daughters and his wife. And let's change to the next one. I love this picture. This is Julius and the family on their visit to Germany. So this is them with the German relatives. And these are the Rosenwald children down front. Julius in the middle, and his wife Gussie is on the left. And those are the German relatives. But then he started to think about using his money to benefit other people. This was, of course, very much in the Jewish tradition of tzedakah, that it's your responsibility. It's not a luxury, it's your responsibility to use your money in a socially productive way. And there's a famous quote from Julius as a young man where he said the dream of his life was to have an income of $15,000 so he could have $5,000 for his family and $5,000 to save and $5,000 to give away. So that dream was realized beyond his wildest dreams. And at the time he met Booker T. Washington, he was just beginning to think seriously about philanthropy. Two things had kind of pushed him towards thinking about the African American community. One was that in 1908, one of the first big race riots occurred in Springfield, Illinois. And Julius was not there at the time, but it certainly caught his attention that his hometown was roiled for 3 days with this terrible riot. The military was called in, and it was just at the time that Julius's attention had been drawn to pogroms, which were state-sanctioned violence against Jews in Europe, and many wealthy American Jews were donating money to help Jews in Europe. And he suddenly went, wait a minute, we're doing exactly the same thing to our black people here in this country. And he really was struck by the kind of dichotomy there. He also was given a copy of Up From Slavery by a friend, and he read it, and so when he had the opportunity to meet Booker T. Washington, he jumped at it. He was anxious to meet him. The two men, interestingly, hit it off. They were sort of similar. Julius ran Sears, Booker ran Tuskegee. They were both very practical, successful, action-oriented, and so Booker T. Washington lost no time. He immediately asked Julius if he'd join the board of Tuskegee, and Julius, being cautious, said, well, I have to come visit first. So in October of 1911, Julius and his wife Gussie and about 15 of their friends and relatives took a private train car down to Tuskegee and visited the campus. So you can change. This building, sadly, is no longer standing, but this is the original campus, the original chapel on the campus of Tuskegee. And Julius was taken by many things he saw down there: the classrooms, the students, the faculty, the staff. But the final night of his visit was held in the chapel, and Washington gave a speech, and Julius made some remarks, and then the students sang spirituals. And, you know, in this time, it was before radio, it was before records. People like Julius had never really heard this music. And it was something that had been cultivated at Fisk. You probably heard of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. And so it was something that they did at Tuskegee, and it moved Julius tremendously. He found it very impressive, and he loved the music. And one of my favorite anecdotes about Julius is that several years later, after he had joined the board, he had to miss a board meeting because he was on a trip to the Middle East. So he sent a telegram to Tuskegee saying, I'm so sorry to miss the board meeting, but I'm walking in Jerusalem just like John. And that was his favorite hymn, and they sang it at the memorial service at Tuskegee. So Julius and Booker are now collaborating. They're working on Tuskegee, and Julius says to Booker T. Washington, well, what else do you need? I'm helping Tuskegee, what else do you need? And so Booker, of course, was ready with an answer. He said, we need schools. In the countryside, there are lots of places where African American children go to school in rundown shacks, they go to school in churches, or they don't go to school. And then he said he had gotten to know Rosenwald well enough to know that he was very thrifty and very kind of self-motivated and interested in projects that motivated people. And he said, you know, in these communities, people are already raising money. People want schools. So you're not going to be building schools for them. You're going to be building schools with them. And so they agreed to start by building 6 schools in the area right around Tuskegee. And they did that, and Julius came and visited the schools, and he was absolutely overwhelmed. Not just to see the children, but to see whole communities turn out to welcome him. Okay, this is one of the first Rosenwald schools. It's in a place called Cheehaw. You can see that it's in the middle of the country. and let's change to the next one. This also is an Alabama school, and I love this picture because you can see that the previous picture had the school children. This picture has the entire community. It was a source of pride for the entire community to have one of these schools. And so Julius was sold on the program. And so they agreed to build 100 more schools and then 300 more schools. And by the time Julius Rosenwald died in 1932, there were over 5,000 schools and school-related buildings that had been built across the South in 15 states by this collaboration among the Rosenwald Fund, the state governments, which another one of Booker T. Washington's great strengths was he was connected to he knew people in local government, and the states were all providing 2 school systems, and stressed for budgets as school systems always are. So he presented to them, okay, we're going to help build the school, and then you'll have the school. So it was promoting the idea of public education, because these schools then became part of the public school system. The school system had to maintain them, and there was that much more progress made towards the idea of public schools. As I mentioned earlier, one of the remarkable things about the schools was that African American communities contributed such a large amount of money. They were really sources of tremendous pride in the communities where they were, and the people who went to them had a great sense of ownership. There are many places where local families donated the land. The school might be named for the local family. Local families helped build the school. They were merchants. And then once the school was built, helped to maintain them. There were Rosenwald School work days where people in the community came and repainted and worked on the garden. And so the schools had tremendous vitality for the people in the communities. When segregation ended, the schools in many places closed because the consolidated school systems were often put in the white school building, which was usually bigger and usually better. And so in a lot of places, the schools fell apart, disappeared, passed into private hands, and in the last 20 years, the movement to preserve the Rosenwald schools, to preserve the structures, and to use them to tell the story of the schools has really gained strength. Okay, let's change. I love this picture. This is a school in Texas, and as you can see, most schools were not named Rosenwald. Your school here is somewhat unusual that it's named Rosenwald, but this school, as you can see, they spelled the name wrong. Okay, let's. I also love this picture. This also is a school in Texas. This is called the Friendship School. And you can see that they were just in such isolated places, many of these schools. They were just, there were no other schools around. The schools, the Rosenwald Fund used a system of Rosenwald school agents, who were people who went out into the communities to help encourage them with the idea. They didn't want to put a school unless there was a lot of enthusiasm for it in the community. So the Rosenwald school agents would go out and talk to people and see how things were going, see if they were raising money, help do the paperwork with the Rosenwald Fund. The person in the middle of this picture is Robert Moten, who became president of Tuskegee after Booker T. Washington died in 1915. So these were the people who went out and made connections in the communities. So in the last 20 years, there has been a movement to find and preserve the schools. This sign is in North Carolina. North Carolina had over 800 Rosenwald schools. It had more than any other state. And this is outside of Charlotte, Rosenwald School Street. This is also North Carolina, and this is, I said to my husband when we visited this school, this Castalia school down there, I said, gosh, if it looks like this in 2010, what did it look like in 1912? I mean, you know, it was very, very rural areas. And one of the stories that you'll hear over and over again from people who went to Rosenwald schools is they walked a long way to get to school. They walked 2 miles or 3 miles. They lived on farms, scattered around, and they walked to get to school. This also is a school in North Carolina. This is called Walnut Cove, and it's used by the town as a senior center, and then they use it for their town council meetings. And what I love about it is you can see they've had this mural painted. And so the mural shows the school, and it shows classes of children. But up in the sky, looking down, you have Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and this is Mr. Williams, the first principal of the school. So I particularly like that one. This is what the inside of many schools looks like today. Many of them have just been left since the time they were last used as schools. One of the things you'll see here is a typical feature of Rosenwald schools, which is partitions. Many of them had 2 classrooms with a partition between them, and the partition could be taken back, and then the 2 classrooms became a meeting room that the community could use for graduation ceremonies or meetings or even social occasions. This might look familiar to some of you. This is the inside of your Julius Rosenwald High School, which has been full of hay for the last 20 years. And apparently it was a stroke of good luck that the hay got put in there because it helped keep the school dry. And I was saying that maybe I should get a delivery of hay for my basement. This is the Scrabble School in Rappahannock County, Virginia, that I first visited in 2010. And this group of women, most of them went to the school. And you'll see that there's one white woman. This school functioned as an integrated school for 1 year in 1968 before it was closed. And it was closed, and the county decided to put their dumpsters in front of the school. And so it was boarded up. It became the county dump. And then the husband of one of these women, who has since died, but he had gone to the school, then worked in Washington, D.C. for 30 years and moved back. And he said, you know what, we need to preserve that school. And so he started pestering the county, and they got one of the Lowe's home improvement stores, gave some grants to Rosenwald schools. He got a Lowe's grant, they renovated the school, and it's now a senior center and a small museum, a small heritage center. This is the outside of the school now. So it's beautifully restored, it's serving the community, and it's also telling the story of the schools. This is a school in Prince George's County, near where I live, that one of the nice things about this school is that Mildred Ridgely Gray, whose family gave the land for this school, is 90 years old, and she's still alive, and she likes to come to talk to people about the school, and it was my privilege to meet her there. And this lady in red, you'll see, is one of the Deltas, the black sorority, and the Deltas have adopted the school as a service project. And so it's open to the public as a museum, and the Deltas staff it. The next picture is this is the inside of the school, which they've restored to look like a school, I guess in the 30s, probably 20s or 30s. Okay. This is Second Union School in Goochland, Virginia, not too far from here, which has been beautifully renovated. And this is the alumni who gathered last spring. I was there with them and gave a talk, and they turned out at the school. Okay. And I think this is the school in Texas. Let's take the next picture. This is the Linden School, and I visited there last year, just about this time, Black History Month. These women are alumni, and the woman in the front on the right taught at the school for 40 years. And they get together regularly to make quilts, and then they do presentations at local schools where they use quilts to tell the story of the Underground Railroad, and they sing spirituals. And 2 years ago, the National Trust for Historic Preservation had a Rosenwald School Conference in Tuskegee. And these ladies were there, and they raffled off one of their quilts, and I won the raffle. And so I have a beautiful quilt that they made. And Flo Stevenson, who's she's the smiling lady in the back row, told me that when they visit schools, they like to take them a quilt made in their school colors. I mean, these ladies have a lot of energy. So I have a beautiful quilt that they made. One of the interesting parts of the Rosenwald School story is that I think it connects very directly to the story of civil rights. And this is John Lewis, congressman from Georgia. He went to a Rosenwald school. And it was my privilege to meet him and to put a copy of my book in his hands. I haven't gotten a book report from him yet, so I don't know if he's read it. But today, when I was touring your high school, in the shop building next to it, there's a bunch of stuff that's just been there since the school closed. And I picked up a book, and it was a civics textbook from 1922. And it said, "The main purpose of the school is to create good citizens." And I thought that was so interesting, because I think one thing Rosenwald schools did was they definitely created good citizens. And they created people who took the concept of citizenship very seriously. And when it came time for the civil rights movement, fortunately, there were wonderfully gifted leaders, but there was also a generation of educated, knowledgeable people with the confidence to boycott the buses for a full year in Montgomery, Alabama, and to march and sing and stand up for what they knew were their rights. And I think you can trace it rather directly to the fact that so many of them had been educated. And the statistic that's usually used is that in the 20s and 30s and 40s, about a third of all African American children in the South went through Rosenwald schools. So I think there's a very direct connection to what came later. I just have two more pictures. This is a little random, but it's of interest to me. This is the president with Jay Johnson, who's the new Secretary of Homeland Security. Jay Johnson's grandfather was a man named Charles Johnson, who was a sociologist and who worked very closely with the Rosenwald Fund. And in addition to funding the schools, Julius Rosenwald funded a program of fellowships to promising individuals. And so Jay Johnson's grandfather was one of the people who got one of these Rosenwald fellowships. And so I'm interested that we're still kind of reaping the benefits of that today. This is my last picture. My husband and I had the good fortune to go on a civil rights field trip that was led by Julian Bond. Julian Bond's father actually worked for the Rosenwald Fund for many years and was one of the people who went around to look at the schools and inspect the schools. And so on our field trip, we went to Selma and we walked over the Pettus Bridge. And on the other side of the Pettus Bridge, there's a small voting rights museum. And this is behind the museum. And I thought that concept, education is the key to control our destiny, was certainly in the minds of all those people who scrimped and saved and donated money to create the Rosenwald schools and had the vision to want them and to insist that their children went to them. So that's the story, and you're part of it because you have such a powerful thing here.
When Booker T. Washington founded Tuskegee, was there opposition from the white community around there to this whole concept? Or?
I don't think there was as much opposition as you might think. He was very compelling. And one of the things that he was always good at was kind of talking to both sides of the street. So when he moved to Tuskegee, one of the things that he made it his business to do was to go visit the local the people who ran the town, and to tell them, you know, would you rather have a population of young people who are ignorant, or would you like to have them in school learning, preparing to go out to careers as teachers? And that was always one of the tools that he used. It was also one of the things that he later became criticized for, was that he made it his business to be non-threatening. But I think it worked to his advantage in that he was able to effectively communicate the fact that this is an important thing for your welfare as well as for ours. Obviously, that's a complicated story about which there's a ton to learn.
When the school closed in 1958, it left the elementary part there. My wife and several of her siblings still attended until Fairfields of the slash Charlotte was built. Right? So, but after that, it closed. And no one had any use for it. The county sold it. There were several people that wanted to get it back, but I'm not going to get into politics. I'm not going to do that. But the interesting thing is that now we have the foundation that was spearheaded by Reverend Morris of Charlotte. And one of the interesting things is some of the same trustees that built the church built the school, that took leadership. Some of the same people, some of the same families were involved in building both of them. And with Dr. Allison being the first principal, it lasted up, and Reverend Ruffin. And this is what happens. Reverend Ruffin was a 3-time principal and pastor of Julius Rosenwald. Now you know he had to be a smart man to do that, to maintain it. Now, I was speaking to Stephanie earlier. One of the interesting things about Booker T. Washington, and you'll read it if you ever get his book, Up From Slavery. When he went to Hampton Institute at that time, his belief was in dignity and work. He believed the inner labor that you perform, it went together, hand in hand. And when he went to Tuskegee, when they built the different buildings with the brick masons built the buildings, and what the question that you had about resentment, one of the things that they did, they put plots. They raised their own food. Mm-hmm. They raised their own food out there. And they sold a lot of their own food. It was a Booker T. Washington, I mean, it was back in, the man was ahead of his time. He really was. Now, for this building is concerned, and I hope you have it, we are working diligently to get started on this building, which opened in 1917, and hopefully we can have it open in 2017 for the 100-year anniversary. That's our goal. That's our goal. But we're going to need a lot of help. We're going to need a lot of help. But where's Sean? Sean said he would help us. He's the new director of the museum. He said he would help us. But I'm the treasurer of the foundation. And I'm here tonight to support Stephanie. Stephanie was here last year. The year that we had one of our banquets, we're having several fundraisers come up in several classes, different classes, have come forward and said they were going to help us out. Class of 71 is going to help us out this spring. They didn't have anything to do with it. But there's, like we talked about, connections. I can't tell you what that school produced. We had the first black pilots come out of that school. We had architects come out of that school. We had lawyers come out of that school. Doctors come out of that school. And guess what? This is the kick. Now think about this. In 1944, they taught aeronautics at that school. They taught aeronautics. My mother-in-law and some of her classmates still had books. You said, what? They taught aeronautics. But this is the the thing. I'm 70 years old. When I was coming along, I had my father fish practically. He said, son, are you going to go out here and be a fisherman? And, oh, no. I left it. I left the area. And I lived in D.C. for 40 years. I'm a retired firefighter. And I went through the whole government thing. I've done it all. Post office, printing office, treasury, you name it. I've done it. But I'm looking back because you got to remember from whence you come. You can't forget. And you got to reach back. And what reason why I'm doing what I'm doing is that I got to think about, I just told Stephanie, I spoke last week at the church. They want me to come back on the first Sunday. I'm tired. But the youth of the day have no idea who Booker T. Washington was or Julius Rosenwald. They don't have a clue. Don't have a clue. But it's up to us.
It's up to us. Well, I think that's a really important and maybe a good place to end this. The schools are a great tool, an educational tool to tell this story. And it's sort of funny that sometimes the recent past, and let's face it, this history is fairly recent, slips away faster than the distant past, because the recent past hasn't been documented as much. And so I think this is a real opportunity to tell this extremely important story. Just to your question as to why it closed, segregation ended, and so it was ragged. In other words, it didn't end the day the Supreme Court handed down Brown versus Board of Education. It took a long time, and in Virginia, that history is complicated. In every jurisdiction, it was a little different how it happened. But in most places, the schools were consolidated, and they were consolidated to the white school, which was usually a better building. And so then the black school was obsolete, and it was either torn down or sold or something. Anyway, thank you very much. I'd be happy to visit with you and sign copies of your book or just chat.